The BFG by Ronald Dahl. Chapter 1 The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right on top her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room into her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by the street. Not even the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in deep sleep. All the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught in bed after lights out, even if you said you had to go to the lavatory. That was not accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached for her glasses that lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses. She could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on and she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over the window. When she reached for the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She had longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everywhere was deathly still. The longing to look after became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly she ducked under the curtains and leaned out the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, houses like fairy tales. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road she could see Mrs. Ridd's shop, where you could buy buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that, too. Sophie allowed her eyes to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up on the street opposite side. It was something black, something tall and black, something very tall and black and very thin. Chapter 2. Who? It wasn't a human. It could be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall it was higher than the upstairs window of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was like her whole body, frozen with fright. This is what they called witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On and on it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then move on, then it would stop again. Well, what on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see it now what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer on the upstairs window of each street. It was actually had to bend down and peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in. Then it would slide on to the next house and stop again and peer in. And so on all along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously it was not human, but it could definitely a person, a giant person perhaps. Sophie had stared across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that was what he was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand he was holding a very long thin trumpet. In the other hand he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped right now in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gucce's house. The Gucces had a green grocer's shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived above the shop. The 2 Gucce children slept in the upstairs room. Sophie knew it. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucce were sleeping. From the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw this giant step back and pace and put the suitcase on top of the pavement. He bent over and opened the suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw top. He unscrewed the jar and poured what was in the end of the long trumpet thing. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet through the open stairs window of the room where the Gucci children were sleeping. The giant took a deep breath and poof, he blew through the trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious that whatever had been in the jar is now blown through the trumpet to the Gucci children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet through the window, they bent down to pick up the suitcase. He had happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of the enormous, pale, wrinkly face and the most enormous ears. The nose was sharp as a knife. And above the nose there were two bright, flashy eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There were a fierce and devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. There she crouched, still as a mouse and tingling all over.